Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Enid Geyer, Associate Dean for Information Resources and Technology, and also Director of the library. The library provides lots of services and resources to support our faculty, staff, and students in their learning, teaching, research, and patient care activities, and publishing certainly falls within that range. Scholarly publishing has been a hot topic for a very long time, and with all the recent changes in the industry, it remains a topic. As evidenced by all of you being here, even though we're serving food, I know there's interest in this topic based on the number of questions that we get in the library, anything from how do I start to how do I get my publication noticed. So it's something that most people are interested in, and it's certainly not a surprise because it's so fundamental to our success in academics and in our careers for advancement and also for recognition. So today we are very fortunate to have George Woodward here from Elsevier. George is the executive publisher, and he's here to talk to us about the changing world of scholarly publishing. George has worked in scholarly publishing for the last 15 years, covering a range of subjects from health and medicine to social sciences and the life sciences. Before joining Elsevier, he also worked as a managing editor, overseeing the editorial and review processes for a pair of leading immunology journals. As part of his current role, he presents to researchers and clinicians around the U.S., providing an insider's perspective on the publishing process and how to get the most out of it. While George works for Elsevier, it's very important to note that he is not here to promote the company, but rather talk from a broad perspective about publishing, regardless of where you are submitting or considering to submit. He'll talk about journal publication cycle, ethics, preparing your manuscript, selecting a journal, your rights post-publication, open access publishing, and how to get your paper noticed for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier for your career and for your scholarship. There should be plenty of time for questions, and I think George is going to stop between sections of his presentation to allow for that, so feel free to raise your hand or speak up. He's also told me that he prefers to have an interactive, lively discussion, so I encourage your participation, but to ensure that that happens, we have a few ringers here to make sure that conversation is, I won't say entertaining, but definitely interesting and realistic. So Dr. Mandeep Sidhu is the Associate Professor of Medicine, Division of Cardiology, and Assistant Dean for Medical Education and Student Research here at Albany Med. He has served as the Associate Editor for a Cardiology section of the Clinical Decision Support Text and as a reviewer for the American Journal of Cardiology, Trends in Cardiovascular Medicine, and the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Dr. Sidhu has co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed manuscripts, including book chapters, and is very familiar with the challenges of authorship. Dr. Amy Hahn has also agreed to participate. She is the director of the Albany Medical Center Transplant Immunology Laboratory and a professor in the Department of Surgery. Dr. Hahn has held several editorial roles for the Society of Histocompatibility and Immunogenetics, including chair of the Publications Committee, editor-in-chief of their quarterly publication, co-editor of the 4th edition of the Laboratory Manual, and co-editor of the 25th anniversary commemorative book. She assumed the position of editor-in-chief of Human Immunology, their flagship publication in 2006, and has many years as a reviewer, editorial board, and section editor. Dr. Andrew Chang is a professor of emergency medicine and vice chair of research and academic affairs. Dr. Chang is an experienced researcher and author with publication in peer-reviewed journals, including JAMA and most recently, Academic Emergency Medicine. I thank you all for participating in advance. If you haven't already grabbed some food, I encourage you to do so at any point. It's okay to get up and move around, no problem in doing that. We also understand that the students in the audience may have to leave for a 1 o'clock class. Again, that's absolutely fine. No problem. So right now, though, please join me in welcoming George.
Good afternoon. The other piece of housekeeping I'll just add quickly is that a recording will be available later. So if you do have to leave, you won't miss out on anything. I'll also highlight that my email address is on this very first slide. So if you do have to leave, you don't have a chance to ask a burning question, please feel free to contact me afterwards at that address and I can get back to you. So today, over the next just under 2 hours, we're going to cover a lot of ground. It's already been previewed for you a little bit. We will pause frequently for questions, but the reason that we're spending so much time talking about this is because, as was just acknowledged, it's a changing environment that we're talking about. I'd always like to start with a little bit of history of scholarly journals. They go back to 1665 when Oldenburg publishes the very first journal, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society out of London. And then over the next few hundred years, it starts to take a shape that will probably be familiar to many of you already. Eventually, it starts arriving every month, every quarter, every year. It's usually available to members of a particular society. One of the main benefits of joining that society is to receive that journal. Somewhere, depending on who you ask, between, say, the 19th century and World War II, peer review starts to become more and more of a topic of interest, a way of traditionally doing things with a journal. And the reason it evolves now is because the scientific endeavor has expanded to a point where it's getting increasingly hard to say that a small group of editors could have sufficient knowledge to make judgments on any article that comes across their desks. So they start calling on external reviewers. Then about 30 years ago, things really start to accelerate. It's with the World Wide Web launching, because now you've got new ways of finding the content, you've got new ways of accessing the content. When we think about peer review, we now have new ways of engaging people who maybe weren't involved in that peer review process before because it would have been logistically challenging. Maybe people wouldn't have been aware of their work. 10 years later, Google comes, and all of a sudden, that discovery question becomes that much more complex, or maybe simpler. For a lot of our journals at the moment, Google Scholar are their primary points of entry. Then we skip forward a little bit further. Wikipedia challenges us to think about content creation, knowledge creation, and knowledge dissemination. The open access movement, which is in its second decade at this point, starts saying, well, wait a second, let's think about why do we have to subscribe to these journals? Why do we hide these journals behind what are called paywalls? Isn't there a better, more equitable way of getting access to this content? Social media. If I gave this presentation a few years ago and said, Twitter is a major force in scholarly communications, people would have laughed at me. But at the moment, once every 7 seconds on some form of social media, there's a mention of a scholarly article. It's become a huge part of that conversation. And then over there on the right, the devices that we read it on. Because if you think about, for those first several hundred years, an article was fixed into a certain sized rectangle. It had to be logistically capable of being mailed. It had to follow a similar format. And so if you have figures within them, if you have tables within them, they're limited to a certain small-sized rectangle. But now, people are reading on devices that are originally bigger than your standard journal, but getting increasingly smaller. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means for you as an author as well as a reader. Because writing for someone on a mobile phone is a different prospect in a lot of ways. So what has stayed the same? Oldenburg espoused that there were four main values, four main points that a journal was able to bring. Registration, the timestamp of who officially submitted results first, importance for claiming ownership or at least primacy. Certification, performing peer review to ensure that there's at least hopefully an air of validity to this to help separate out unvetted manuscripts, unvetted science from vetted. And we'll talk plenty about peer review later. Dissemination, as we already talked about, that's changing quite significantly. And then, and this one often gets overlooked in the modern world, preservation. And it's easy to think about that 1665 journal and how there are still copies that exist somewhere in the world. But if you think about an electronic-only journal and all these PDFs, and right now, sure, we have plenty of PDFs, and there's multiple copies of a single article. But as that technology evolves, how are we going to ensure that the articles are not lost, that the knowledge within is not lost? I have a whole drawer full of floppy disks from about 20 years ago that remind me constantly of technology evolving. My disclaimer before I go too much further is scholarly publishing is not a homogeneous enterprise. Needs and practice do vary greatly from one field to another. So I'll try to acknowledge some of the differences, but do bear in mind that for your own specific specialties, there are going to be some changes. Venues of publishing can vary. When I talk to broad audiences, I'm often reminded that computer science values heavily meeting abstracts and those kinds of presentations. Software, different forms of expression like that. Social sciences, humanities, it's about the long form, the monograph. So we're really focusing today on medical publishing, obviously, given the audience. But it is worth bearing in mind that when you try to extrapolate messages or what works in one area of scholarly publishing, it doesn't necessarily mean it translates over to another area. Levels of funding can vary significantly. We'll talk about this particularly in context of the open access movement, where there's a lot of, there's a sense that we can just shift from paying expenses on the reader side to paying expenses on the authorship side, which is all very well and good if you have a massive grant that's willing to underwrite that. But what about people who are conducting smaller studies, people who maybe don't have that same level of funding? What can they do? We'll talk about that. Demographics vary, and this is not necessarily a statement about technology uptake. The largest group of people that I've seen reading print journals in the past 12 months have been groups of students, sitting on planes, passing them around, highlighting them. So demographics can mean a number of different things, such as emergency room doctors read very differently from allergists. They have different setups, they have different practical working conditions. It's going to make a difference. Normal review and publication times can vary. We'll talk a little bit about what to expect. Types of review can vary. And then citation rates. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what you can do to prepare your manuscript to hopefully give it a good chance during the publication process, during the review process. I'm not going to dwell on how you write a manuscript. Hopefully many of you know this, or you all know that there are resources available within the library, within your own departments, who can provide that information. But I am going to dwell a little bit on some of the lessons I've observed being on the editorial side as well as on the publishing side. The first question you want to ask is, what type of manuscript do I have? There's usually three main research-focused or research-based types of article. There's a full-length article, which is a substantial, complete, and comprehensive piece of research. There's a letter or a short communication, sometimes called a brief report. These are smaller. They could be pilot studies, studies where you just don't have that many participants involved, and so you don't have as robust a data set to explore. And then the review papers. And there are a few reasons why it's good to know what kind of paper you're talking about. One is review papers tend to be invited by a lot of journals. So if you have a very good topic, if you have an idea and you've written it up and you send it in unsolicited, it's an easy way for a journal to say, I'm sorry, we only consider solicited reviews. So if you do have an exciting review, I encourage you to reach out to the editors beforehand, looking over editors to make sure they don't disagree. If you do have a topic that you think might be of interest to a journal, it's worth reaching out beforehand. I will say now, I'll refer a few times to contacting a journal. When I say this, I don't mean Google the editor and then look up their personal email address and send it to them. But look on the journal's homepage, see what they provide as the preferred method of communication. So the difference between a full article and a brief communication can also be important, because one of the things that reviewers will easily pick up on is if you're trying to take what's not really a very long paper or a very robust set of results and try to stretch it into 15, 20 pages. It makes it thin, it makes it weak, and it's going to get you criticized by the reviewers. Similarly, although this happens less often, if you try to take a really extensive, complicated set of results and condense them into 2 to 3 pages, something's going to get lost along the way. I'll also note here, I refer to them as letters, and this is an important thing to note, is that what journals call these, it can vary significantly. Brief reports is common. Letters to the editor is actually pretty common. And this is a question I get a lot. It's not really a letter. Why do we call it a letter? And I'll tell you that historically, this actually has some impact factor implications. A lot of the reason why journals call them letters to the editor has to do with the fact that they don't want them to be counted as what's called a source item by the impact factor calculators. Talk about this in a moment, but just in case you're curious. Oh, yes. Okay. So the process of writing the article. As I said, I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but the important thing here is that much like as a reader, very rarely do we read from page 1 to page 10 anymore. Same thing's true of writing it. Right? You're thinking about building that article, starting with the data and then elaborating upon that. You've got the data, then you've got the more literal, the methods, results, the discussion. Then you start to get into that narrative portion that really sets an article apart, the conclusion, the introduction. And really only then should be turning to the title and the abstract. The title is one of the more important parts of the paper. It's the one that people encounter first. This includes all your readers. That's not just the people who are actually reading it after it's published, but this is your reviewers, your editor. It's the first thing that they're going to see. If you lose them with the title, you're going to have a hard time finding them again. But certainly from the readership aspect, if you're looking at a long list of search results and think about your own habits here, if that title doesn't immediately say to you, this is relevant to what I'm looking for, how likely are you to click on it to investigate? So that's why you have to think about your title carefully. You want to use the fewest possible words. To go back to the point I was making earlier about reading on different sized screens, you're dealing with truncation, you're dealing with things going so that you have to scroll, and people really don't like to scroll. You lose a lot of people if you fall beyond that first screen. So you're trying to use the fewest possible words. Keep it condensed, keep it sensible. You want to adequately describe the content. You're not hyping it, you're not making claims. And this is where sometimes it's tempting to use clever titles that maybe have puns in them, maybe have jokes in them. And I'm a huge fan of puns, so don't get me wrong, but you lose a lot of readers that way because they don't know what the article is actually about. And again, if you want them to click through, that's the ultimate goal here. Don't use uncommon abbreviations. As science becomes more and more interdisciplinary, the potential readers are going to be far broader, far wider than your immediate specialty, your immediate discipline. So think about, is this something that translates? Is this something that people who don't know me and don't know my immediate area of expertise would understand? Yes?
Do you recommend putting at least for clinical, do you recommend, at least for clinical research, putting in the type of study in the title itself, like a randomized clinical trial or case control study, et cetera?
Great question. So he was asking if I recommend putting the type of study into the title itself. I would say that increasingly this is being more and more encouraged. Some editors have different feelings about it, often trying to trade off brevity versus descriptiveness. But I think that what we find is editors try to encourage it because they find readers really appreciate it. Is this a mouse study? Is this a human study? You can make things that much more effective for your readers before they click through. Is it a pilot? That's certainly helpful information to include so you know what to expect before you click through. Is it? Probably the most important part of your article is your abstract. And I say this because of the many, many people who will claim to have read your article, most of them will have only read your abstract. It's an advertisement for your article at all levels. When we send a manuscript out to review, the reviewers typically get the title, the abstract, maybe the list of authors. And as the vast majority of reviewers are volunteers who have many other commitments on their time, they need to decide, is this paper going to be worth my attention? Is it worth me putting in the hours it's going to take to review this? And one of the first ways they're going to determine that is based on your abstract.
So I was under the impression that most reviews were blinded, but you're saying they know the authors and the affiliations. Is that always the case?
We'll talk a little bit about that when we get to peer review, but what you're referring to is called double-blind review, which is not the default status in most fields. There are a number of journals that do it that way, but yeah, we'll definitely get into that. Thank you. So, what do you want to do in your abstract? You want to make it interesting, you want to make it understandable, but at the same time you want to be accurate. And this is a huge one. I always include this study, which I really enjoyed, from BMJ a couple of years ago, where they looked at language use in abstracts between the 1970s and today. And they found that the number of words that could be described as positive increased substantially during that time. So an average of 2% of abstracts back in the 70s used words like robust, novel, innovative. When they looked at it in 2014, it was 17.5%, which, granted, science is accelerating, that's wonderful, but at the same time, do we really think that there are 50% more groundbreaking studies, 50% more unprecedented studies than there were back then? It's something that people are becoming increasingly immune to. I work with one editor who has disallowed the use of the word novel anywhere in the article because he says it's just too hard to prove. You're going to send it out for review and someone's going to say, wait a second, that's not novel, and ding you on it. So be mindful about this. Be accurate in reporting it. You do want to make it interesting, though. So think about the best presentation. I always encourage people to read the abstract aloud to someone who maybe doesn't know their research that well. See what questions they have. See what doesn't come out clearly. Another reason that the abstract is important is if you have an abstract that's riddled with typographical errors, with language mistakes, the assumption is going to be that that will carry over into your paper. If you can make that abstract as clean and clear and precise as possible, that's a good indicator of what to expect. Anything from the editors on that one? Okay. So references, tacked on at the end, often forgotten about. There's a few points here. You want to always ensure that you fully absorb the material that you're referencing. There are a few reasons for this. Probably the single largest rule is that if you have miscited or misquoted a particular study, there's a good chance that that person will end up reviewing your paper. And they will point it out. So just make sure that before you cite it, you have actually read it. If you're citing a review article, have you traced it back to the original research to the degree possible? Is that really what those authors said? You want to avoid excessive self-citation or excessive citations of publications from the same institution. A lot of editors do look at the references quite closely. And if you've got, say, 25 references, 23 of which are your group, this tells one of several things. Maybe you didn't do the necessary prep work that was required. Maybe this is a topic that is of absolutely no interest to anyone except you. So you want to think about carefully situating your work in the context of all the work that's come before it. Yes?
And also make sure the references are up to date. There's nothing that looks worse than all the references being from 2000 or earlier.
It's a very good point.
For those who don't know, I'd also recommend using a bibliographic manager such as EndNote, or I think there's another one, Bibliar. There's several of them. And you can often actually search the style of the manuscript and it'll automatically format it. Some want 3 authors, some want 6 authors, some want the title underlined or italicized, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. And that brings me to the last point here. If required, conform strictly to the style given instructions for authors, and this is a lot easier when you have one of those reference managers. There was a study a couple of years ago that we conducted that found that people were spending hours reformatting references, which is a fantastic waste of any researcher or physician's time. So a lot of journals are starting to get a little bit more lax. They're starting to recognize that maybe this is something that can be dealt with later. Maybe a copy editor or typesetter can do a lot of the formatting for you as long as the information's all there. Some journals are sticklers about this, though. So just be mindful of this. I encourage people, and I'll mention this again later, to look at instructions for authors to get a sense of whether they're dealing with one of those strict journals. We'll now move into the world of publication ethics. But before we do, I want to invite any questions about preparing a manuscript that do not involve publication ethics. Okay, good. The other disclaimer I'll add too is I will be around for a little while after today's session ends. So particularly with this next session, if you have any questions that you don't want to ask in front of the group, feel free to come find me afterwards. So publication ethics. What we're going to talk about here is kind of a rough guideline, some basic rules. There are differences from field to field, from country to country. There's a lot of variation here, but I'm going to talk about some general rules. When you submit a paper, you're usually asked to check a number of boxes or submit a form attesting essentially these things: that the work is original, that it's actually yours. I had one case just recently where a reviewer submitted a paper that they'd gotten from another manuscript and put their name on it. And he had signed a little form saying that it was theirs until we found that original paper. That the data are real and not fabricated. That you've obtained any necessary permissions to reprint material that you didn't create. That you've obtained any necessary privacy waivers. This is certainly important for this audience. That you've complied with research standards and publisher and journal ethics and conflict of interest policies. That you're only submitting to one journal at a time. And this is actually another one that comes up quite frequently. And sometimes there's an honest mistake, multiple authors involved, it's not clear who is supposed to be submitting to the journal, and so you end up with a paper submitted multiple times. That's the version we hear a lot, at least. This does happen. Just be mindful, because there are ways of detecting this, and one of the, again, more frequent ways this happens is that the reviewer ends up being the same person that the other journal asked to review the paper, and the reviewer says, hey, I just saw this paper yesterday. And as with many ethics issues, you don't want that to be found out at that point. You want to make sure that anything that might come out later has been disclosed up front, has been dealt with up front, is transparent. You want to ask and you want to acknowledge the contributions of each author. We'll talk in the next slide about what is an author. And you want to make sure that all your co-authors have agreed. Another recent case I had was a situation where a postdoc moved institutions, finished writing up some research, published it, put their old mentor's name on it. I don't know why they left the institution, what was there, but the mentor took exception to the fact that they'd been included as an author and not been consulted about it. And as a result, the paper ended up being retracted because of this. So you want to make sure that all the co-authors know that they're on this paper, that they've agreed with the contents of the paper, and that that's been dealt with pre-submission. So what does authorship mean? It varies across disciplines, cultures, and journals. Probably within medical science, the most commonly accepted definition comes from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE. And they say that to be listed as an author, you have to meet 4 criteria, and you have to meet them all. You have to have made substantial contributions to conception or design of a work, or acquisition, analysis, or interpretation. And you have to be involved in drafting it or revising it before it's submitted. And you have to have given final approval to that version that's submitted. And this is a fairly newer one, you have to agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work in ensuring that questions related to accuracy or integrity are appropriately investigated. So that means if an ethics issue comes up later, you can't say, oh, I had no involvement with that part of the manuscript, ask him. Oh, yes, please.
I got to deal with something like that very recently when a paper had falsified flow cytometry graphs on them. And actually this group had published other falsified graphs in other journals as well, so that's how it was brought to my attention. But the corresponding author said, oh, I don't know anything about that somebody else provided those graphs to me, and I shouldn't be held accountable for that. And we had to say, no, you're all accountable.
Yep.
And we had to retract the paper as well.
No, it's true. It's exactly that. One of the editors I work with likes to call that game blame the postdoc, because that's most often what he hears in response.
Yeah, we had a recent scenario just a few months back where a student had contributed significantly to work being done in a clinical setting and had then gone on to graduate and wrote back and said, I saw that this paper has now been published, and the team that they had worked with and had actually communicated with us over time about the work that was being done, and so the mediation process between the team and the faculty, and now that recent alum came to light. And so these scenarios can happen more commonly than one might think, especially to postdocs or students.
I think that's a very, very fair point. And one of the things that I would emphasize is if you're leaving an institution, make sure that someone there knows how to reach you, particularly your former group. Make sure they have up-to-date contact information. Because another excuse I hear sometimes is, I don't know how to reach that person anymore. They left my institution. So try and maintain that chain of communication if you can.
One comment I would make for those who are sort of more novice in the research is to decide ahead of time with the senior author, senior researcher, the order that you're going to be put in the manuscript, assuming you put in the appropriate amount of work for that order.
Yep, that's very important. Which brings me to my next slide. Thank you. You're setting me up so well. I appreciate this. So here are some general principles, and again, they do vary. A common rule is that the first author is the person who conducts or supervises data collection, analysis, presentation, interpretation of results. And this can make a difference, as was alluded to. If you're a first author, if you're a middle author, if you're the last author, there are some implications there. So do make sure that you've agreed on that beforehand. A lot of journals will allow what's called share or dual first authorship. I've seen one situation where there were 3 first authors. But there are different ways of doing this, but make sure that's been agreed upon up front. Corresponding author. Here it's important to distinguish, you can actually have 2 corresponding authors. The first being the person who is responsible for the submission of the paper and oversees it through the acceptance. And then the second being the person who you put their contact information on the published article for people to reach out to. They don't necessarily have to be the same person, often they are. Why is this important? Because if that contact information is going on the published article, you want someone who there's going to be a reasonable chance that they'll still be reachable at that information within a relatively short amount of time. Some other things to be aware of when it comes to correspondences is that some journals will not allow submissions from people who are using Gmail, Yahoo, personal email accounts. This is because there have been a fairly high-profile number of cases in recent years where people have faked reviewers, faked authors, and supplied these kinds of email addresses that are easy to create and easy to create on behalf of someone else. So if you ever run into that, that's what they're looking to try and avoid. So where possible, do use your institutional address and just be prepared if that becomes an issue. You want to avoid ghost authorship. That's excluding authors who participated in the work. Common, if we think about ghostwriters, right, that used to be a major problem in medical publishing, and it's still probably not fully resolved. Gift authorships. That's including authors who did not actually contribute to the work. So I'm going to turn to conflicts of interest for a moment, because this is another one where, as I said earlier, you want everything disclosed up front. You don't want this coming out because no matter how innocuous it may be, if it comes out after a paper's been published that something was not disclosed, it always sounds more incriminating. It always sounds worse than it probably needed to be. There are a number of different conflicts of interest. When in doubt, disclose. Direct financial, that's probably the one people are most able to easily detect. If you work for a pharmaceutical company, you're not going to hide the fact that you work for a pharmaceutical company. The next one gets a little bit grayer. If you've received indirect financials, so if you've received honoraria, if you've received consultancy fees, if you have been paid to speak at a meeting by a company. This is where people aren't sure, well, how far do I go back? They paid me a pittance. Do I really need to declare that? Again, err on the side of caution. Some journals will be explicit about the time frame. Usually it's about 2 to 3 years going back that you're expected to declare. Some have higher standards, so just know what you're expected. And if worse comes to worse and you've over-declared, overshared, it's certainly a lot better than the opposite. Some of the types of conflict of interest that don't make their way into published papers, but that we still look for, particularly when it comes to, say, reviewers and selecting reviewers, career and intellectual. So if you are up against someone else for a particular position, and they know this, and they don't necessarily want to see you advance, there's a conflict there. Institutional, if someone works in the department down the hall from you, they should not be invited to review your paper. There's too much chance of a personal connection there. And so a lot of editors, a lot of journals will ask you to indicate recommended reviewers or reviewers who you would wish to exclude. Not all of them will use these reviewers, and they certainly will not rely entirely upon them. But if you're thinking about people to suggest, just bear this in mind. Don't suggest your best friend. Don't suggest your colleague from down the hall. Think about people who can honestly, intellectually evaluate your work. And similarly, if you're looking for people to exclude, these are the kinds of conflicts that don't show up in a cursory examination. So if you have a rival who's working on very similar work and there's a competitive situation there, be frank, be open about that. Know that the editor does not have to honor your request there, but the more clear you are about the request, the more likely they will be. My favorite one, I received a request to exclude a certain reviewer because of a physical altercation that had taken place the week before. I was very intrigued by that, but we did not invite that person. When most people think of research ethics, they probably think of this word, plagiarism, which is why I have put it in the middle. Because yes, plagiarism is huge, and it's probably the most common source of ethical complaints, although it's starting to give way to authorship and image manipulation. What is plagiarism? It's the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit, including those obtained through confidential review of others' proposals and manuscript. So the key words there, of course, are without giving appropriate credit. So many plagiarism cases would have been solved by putting quotation marks around something. But instead, people copied someone else's words. They liked the way it was expressed. It was done well. They put it out there. It gets discovered later in the process and becomes a significant problem. Yes?
And Elsevier, at least, and I'm sure the other journals as well, has ways to check for that. So that one of the first things I do when a paper comes in, if it looks, I'll look at the title and the abstract, and if it looks interesting, the next thing I click on is Crosscheck. Yes. And it tells me what % of that paper has been taken from other sources. And I've seen them as high as 70, 80%, and it can be whole paragraphs from other papers. And it's very easy to tell. Usually in the introduction, because it's very easy when you're writing that to say, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll cite that work. And we often see it in papers written by people whose first language isn't English. So if we see really, really nicely crafted sentences followed by really bad sentences, we know that there's a problem there.
Do you have any comments about sort of plagiarizing your own work? You know, kind of reusing language you've used in the past, maybe modifying a little bit?
You were a slide early that time, but I'll forgive you. So yes, exactly that. So can you plagiarize your own work, right? You said something beautifully before, why can't you use those same exact words? Or the methodology is the same. This creates a little bit of a gray area here because technically, as was mentioned, there's these software programs, right? That will pull that up. It will say, wait a second, we've seen this exactly somewhere before. Now, without getting too much into the legality of it, there are certain issues to consider around copyright and any forms that might have been filled out with regard to that earlier on. But what it really comes down to, I think, is that if you pick up, say, the conclusions are duplicated from another article that you wrote, that's obviously going to be more of a problem than you borrowing a couple of lines from your introduction, because the introduction is a little bit more general, a little bit more stage setting. You still should be writing around it to avoid that, because technically you're not allowed to, in most cases, use the same language. The grayest area is methodology, because there are reasons why you would want to be consistent in describing that. And that's why with those different software programs, it does give you an overall percentage, but you also get to see the details. And editors will use their discretion there. They'll say, well, this person, it's got a percentage, but if you look at it, it's mainly around the methodology. So is this a significant problem? I probably work with the person to think about how they can redo that. Because probably the worst thing for methodology is you read one article and it says, please see the methods that I published previously in reference 3, and then you go there and it says, please see the reference 6, and you go down this black hole of methodology. So there are reasons that you want that methodology section to be robust, to be consistent. But if I'm running a duplication check and I start seeing that not only are the methods the exact same, but the sample size is the exact same, some of the results start to get to look the exact same, that's where you're really getting into some problematic areas as well. And these are all things that come up under the guise of plagiarism, because it's being detected in that way. So in general, I say avoid where you can, quote where you can, especially if it is something you really like the way you said before. You refer people back to your own work, and that's a positive all around. I'll go here. So we talked about Crosscheck, and this is a little bit more about what it is. Why do you want to make sure you cite this? And some journals actually place limits on citations, and that can make it that much trickier. And I acknowledge that. You want to place your own work in context, acknowledge the findings of those before you, and maintain credibility and accuracy. I joke about not wanting to go down that rabbit hole of methodology, but at the same time, there's useful information if you know that the same methodology has been followed in multiple articles, and being able to compare across that and see how the results came out. I had an author ask me recently, how do I find all of the published papers that use this particular mouse model? Because she was really curious to see how it was being used and what could be derived from it. Image manipulation is probably the up-and-coming star of the research ethics world, and this is in part because increasingly there are technological ways of detecting it. Much like with plagiarism, we don't know that plagiarism is actually growing. There's actually some science that's decreasing, but our awareness of it, our ability to detect it, has certainly increased. Same thing is true of image manipulation. And there's a lot of well-meaning, I'm going to say vigilante, realizing that can be a loaded word, but there are a lot of people who are running these sort of scripts to go through previously published articles and detect any anomalies. And then writing to editors and saying, well, did you notice that panel 3B over here is exactly the same as panel 2 in this other figure if you flip it around? And these are exactly the kinds of things that the technology is well suited to detect. So again, general rules here. No specific feature with an image can be enhanced, obscured, moved, removed, or introduced. Adjustments of brightness, contrast, or color balance are usually acceptable as long as they don't obscure anything. What we're talking about is the difference between manipulation for clarity versus manipulation to deceive or to take advantage of maybe an image that looked better over here, and so you want to splice it into that other one because that panel was better. Nonlinear adjustments must be disclosed. Figures or parts of figures, and this is where most people get caught up, should not be duplicated or spliced together from figures published elsewhere, unless you're declaring that. There are opportunities here. There might be reasons why a figure could legitimately appear in more than one article, but you would need to disclose that and make it clear as to what's going on and why. So when in doubt, disclose and cite. So what are the consequences of all these ethical issues? They get more severe as the process goes on. If it's found in a submitted article, then the paper is probably returned. Maybe, depending on the severity, a conversation is had. As you go further down that process, though, especially once it's published, there are a few recourses. Expressions of concern, corrections, retraction. Most journals at this point are members of the Committee on Publication Ethics and will follow their standardized workflows. And for most forms of workflow, if the editor is not convinced by your explanation, one of the next steps ends up being talk to the dean of the institution. And I don't know how well you know your deans, but that is not a conversation you want to be having with any of them. So again, make sure you've disclosed up front. There are legitimate consequences here, and with the increasing use of technology in all aspects of our lives, it is becoming easier to detect things that previously were not as easily detectable. So before we go into the next section, any questions about this that people want to ask publicly? And again, I will be available later if you have a personal situation that you'd like to discuss. Okay, good. Everyone is ethically compliant. We are ready to move on to selecting a journal. You've got your paper written, it's ready to go. So how do you decide which journal is going to hopefully publish your paper? There are three basic questions that I recommend. How do I reach the right audience for my paper most effectively? How long should I expect to wait for a decision? This can be important in certain situations where if you have a deadline that you're working toward. And what is the reputation of the journal? And this is probably most important because the reputation of the journal still carries a lot of weight with different evaluators. We'll talk about the metrics side of it in a minute, but what you'll find is that people sometimes use the journal as a shortcut to filter based on quality. So by extension, the reputation of a journal becomes attached to your paper in that journal. How do you identify an appropriate journal? One is you can look at the references. Right? If you're citing an article that was published in another journal that is very relevant to your research, they've already indicated they're interested in this kind of research. So maybe that's a potential home. There's a number of different sources you can use for keywords, PubMed, Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science, they go on. Asking your supervisor or colleagues for recommendations. This is where you get the inside information sometimes that no journal is going to publicize about itself. But journals are driven by people. They're human enterprises, ultimately. And so this is where your PI might be able to say, I know the new editor-in-chief of that particular journal, this is not an area that they're that interested in encouraging, or maybe this is an area they're really excited about, and that's where they want to see the journal moving. You also get some of the experiences, the personal experiences people have had with the journal. I submitted to them several times over the years, and I've never gotten back a decision earlier than 6 months. Right? This is important information for you to know. So talking to people. Librarians. Not only do they help broker the access to all of the journals, they also have any number of databases, resources for analyzing, finding out information about those journals. And even if it's a journal they're not familiar with, they have the tools that they can use to drill in deeper and find more information that will hopefully inform your decision. You could use a free service. Pretty much every publisher has their own at this point, and there are some publisher-agnostic cross-publisher ones, where you paste in your abstract and it spits out some recommendations about what journal might work. It's a matchmaker, and I find that you want to use more than one, and you also have to go in with a bit of a sense of humor to this, because like with any matchmaker, you're going to get some obvious answers. You're going to get some that, I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense. And then you're going to get some that really make you question what this tool is reading into you and your research that made it think that this was a good idea. So just be mindful of that, and do try a few if that's the route you want to go. Always make sure you've read the aims and scope for any prospective journal. Just because something looks like it's a good fit based on its title, based on some of these other evaluations, doesn't mean that that's really the aspect of research that they're interested in. So take a look at the aims and scope. What do they list out as fields they're interested in? Are there any particular approaches that they're more interested in, mechanistic versus translational versus clinical, et cetera? You always want to make sure you're realistic about your paper. Realistically, the first journal you submit to is probably not going to be the journal that ends up publishing it. Most papers do get submitted more than once. So think about, where do I want to be submitting it? What kind of research do I have here? Do I have New England Journal of Medicine paper? If you do, that's great. It's certainly a prestigious journal with a very high rejection rate. So think carefully before you invest that time and that energy. Is this where you want to go? Is it the leading journal in my specialty? Is that a better home for it? So think carefully, and like with applying for college, don't not go for the stretch school. Certainly know where you're probably going to end up, and maybe have a safety school or two in mind just in case. But you just want to do that work up front, and you'll end up saving yourself, hopefully, some time and energy. Yes?
So I'm not sure if you're going to talk about it soon, but about the predatory journals, and sometimes if you're not familiar with a journal outside your own field, I usually run it against the Beals list to make sure it's not on there.
That's a great, actually, recommendation for that, and I am going to talk about it on the next slide. Which is perfect. So I'm framing it more as new journals, right? Journals that you don't know, journals that you're not familiar with. It could be a journal that just launched. Because you have to be perhaps more diligent with them than with any other journal. Obviously, a journal that's been around for 150 years, it's hard for them to fake it for that long without that reputation getting out. A new journal, it's a little bit more feasible. And of course, it's worth noting that every journal was new at some point, right? So just because it's new does not make it inherently bad or inherently something that you need to be unnecessarily suspicious of. But you do have to do due diligence. So there's some questions to ask. Who's involved, and are they really? Take a look at the editorial board. Take a look at any authors who've published in it already. If it's the editorial board you're looking at, if it's someone who you know or you know someone who knows, it doesn't hurt to reach out to them and just make sure that they really are affiliated with it, because there are known scams where people will just list random researchers, sometimes not even real researchers, to make their editorial boards look good. I've seen cases where people use stock imagery from a Google search and put that person as their editor because they know the images make it look that much more legitimate. Sorry, Lana, you've heard this story before. I found one which I wish I had screenshotted at the time. I was looking at a list of editors, and I thought, that face looks familiar. And it was Taylor Swift, who I'm sure has many talents, but probably was not qualified to be the editor of this engineering journal that I was looking at. So take a look at that, be mindful, and be critical, like with anything you find on the internet, right? Ask yourself, what promises are made regarding peer review? A reference was made to the term predatory journal. What this usually means is the idea that they are extracting money for you without providing really any service. And for journals, a lot of this is around peer review, certainly. And if it's a journal that says, we will turn your paper around in 24 hours, fantastic for you, but the chances of them sending it out to external reviewers who will say, sure, I'd like to review this, then actually review it, then return those reviews, then the editor looks at those reviews and makes a decision within 24 hours are remarkably slim. And yes, some papers, a very small percentage, have been sent out for, or have been accepted without going out for peer review. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But in general, this is something that you should be expecting. Has the journal, oh yes, please.
Well, no, there's just some really kind of funny, interesting stories on the web if you search, where people will submit things to these predatory journals with, every other word's an expletive, or, autocorrect off your phone, and they just instantly publish it, and they say, just pay us $500 and we'll publish your study. And it's just absolute gibberish.
Yep.
But also, if you have a legitimate paper and you accidentally send it to one of those journals, they're going to sit on it forever. It will never get published. And then you, because of the ethics, you can't submit it to a real journal to get it published. So you end up really stuck.
Just to build on that a little bit, so the main company that's involved with this is called Omnix International. It's in India. And they have thousands of these predatory journals, but they also have these predatory conferences, and you might get an email inviting you to be a speaker, and it's like some conference in India, or you might be asked to be on the editorial board of a journal, and you'd be like, wow, this is really nice. It'll be nice to put on my CV, but don't do it. That's like a predatory journal. Once they get your name, it's going to stay on there. It's going to be hard to retract that, and that's going to impair your future career. So just, you got to be really careful about this. And the librarian that kind of keeps track of this is a guy named Beall, B-E-A-L-L. He's in Denver. So he keeps a list of all the predatory journals out there, and it's well over, I think now, 2,000 journals.
Just quickly on that, he doesn't anymore. Yeah, that was taken down for some reasons. But yes.
But there is a website that it does keep up.
Yep.
Uses his list and keeps up with the new list. And it's
Yep.
not only old mix, there's a lot of this.
Yep. Yeah.
And these emails always, every morning, they come at between 1 and 6 a.m. So when you wake up and you look at your email, these types of emails. But all of these points just remind us that please, if you have a question, speak to team members, speak to senior folks in the department, or the librarians, especially Liz Ayers and Tracy Tosh from the medical student perspective, but from all perspectives. I think it's important to reach out. If you see something that doesn't make sense, please ask.
Yeah. And I understand that the librarians have actually been going around to different departments giving talks on this topic, so if you're interested in hearing more. So some other questions to ask. Has the journal published any articles yet, and are they any good? There's sometimes an advantage to being a first mover. I would argue this might be a situation where it's not. You're judged by the company you keep and the journal's reputation, so take a look at the articles that are coming out. Are they good? Are they from people who you would be comfortable being published in the same journal with? Are they legitimate researchers in your field? Often overlooked one, what are the journal's archiving policies if publication ceases? It can be relatively easy to create a dishonest journal. Anyone with 5 minutes on a website can do that. Creating a legitimate journal takes quite a bit more endeavor. But to create an illegitimate one, no problem. Which is fine because it's also very easy to shut down. So if you're entrusting your article to this, as was mentioned, ethically, right, it's already been submitted, it's already been published, your hands are kind of tied. If that journal folds, so investigate what are their policies. If you go out of business, if this journal disappears, what happens to my article? I highlight a couple of initiatives here which are aimed at archiving content in journals or publishers that go out of business. Clocks and Portico, they maintain essentially a dark archive. If that journal goes out of business, the content becomes available through another source. So my take-homes here are beware of predatory journals, but remember not all journals are predatory. Another one that sometimes can be troubling, the time was mentioned. Sometimes people will look at the level of English on a website, right? And certainly there might be reasons to make you take an extra look at that journal, but also we need to be mindful that we are not biasing ourselves against journals from parts of the world where maybe the level of English isn't as high, where maybe there are some complications. So I think that that's the difficult balance we're trying to walk here, is how do you use certain things as tells that maybe there's something worth investigating versus a journal that's being launched perfectly legitimately, best of intentions, but doesn't necessarily have some of those same elements that we would expect. Remember, even for legitimate journals, new journals will not yet be indexed in Medline, PubMed, or other services. They won't have an impact factor that can take years after launch. So just be mindful of this. I've launched new journals over my career, and usually within, say, the first 3 papers that get published, someone will write to me and say, great, when's the show get in PubMed? It doesn't work that way. PubMed wants to know that a journal is going to be around for a little while. So you have to have a certain corpus. You have to have built up a certain volume of published articles before you can index in PubMed Central, before you can submit to Medline. And they do have standards. They do go through and evaluate. And a lot of journals get rejected on the first try and have to go back. So just be aware of this in terms of the visibility of your article. Not necessarily a reason to avoid the journal, just trying to avoid surprises. And there is a website, thinkchecksubmit.org, which has some other good questions that you might consider asking. I've made reference to the impact factor a couple of times. I think it's worth acknowledging because I think we all know that in certain evaluation committees, promotion tenure committees, sometimes funders, the impact factor does carry some weight. It's a metric that was originally created to help librarians make decisions between journals in the same field. particularly understanding the fact that you couldn't be experts in every journal. It has taken on this life of its own and is now used for all sorts of things it was never originally intended to be used for. That doesn't make it necessarily a bad metric, just a metric that maybe is being misapplied in some circumstances. So what is the actual impact factor? How do you determine it? There's a number of times that papers in a journal are cited on average. However, so to take the current impact factor, the one that you'd find if you went to any journal promoting its impact factors webpage. The current impact factor is based on 2017 cites to articles that were published in 2016 and 15. And then you divide by the number of articles published in 2016 and 2015. So you can probably see right away that this is a very small window that you're looking at. If you have this one article that gets really popular 5 years later, it's not going to affect the journal's impact factor. It's not going to have any influence. If you've got one article that gets 100 citations and you only publish 2 other articles and they get 0, you have an impact factor of 33. That looks great. So it can be really thrown off by the size of the journal, what I call blockbuster effect, if you've got these really big performing articles. It can also be influenced by editorial policies. Not necessarily gaming the system, although I talked earlier about letters to the editor and why they may be called that. But review articles tend to be cited on average about 30% more than original articles. So if you look at lists of the highest impact factor journals in any category, you usually find review journals tend to gravitate towards the top. If a journal publishes 5 original articles and 25 reviews, it has a better chance of having a higher impact factor. So there are a number of factors that go into it that you should probably be aware of for using it to determine too much. I don't want to downplay the significance of it to certain evaluators. So know your own field, know what people are likely to be looking at, but I would encourage you to not make your decisions about what journal to publish in entirely based on one metric. Yes?
The impact factor can also be influenced by the editor themselves. There are some who, when you submit, they insist that you cite a certain number of papers from that journal. There are also some who write sort of an editorial at the end of the year where they cite every paper that was submitted or published in that year. So there are lots of ways of gaining that system.
It's very true. I mean, any metric, it's amazing the creativity you see. If you are asked as a condition of acceptance that you cite a certain number of articles from that journal, just so you know that's not okay. That's pretty much universally frowned on at this point. So if you see that, just know that and think about who you might alert. Did you have?
The other point, I think we have to have a balanced approach to the impact factor, and there are also very reputable sources of impact factors within any given field, which I think can also help you to understand journals, especially when you speak with mentors and other members of the team, because otherwise you may continue to go back to the journals that you've previously been involved with, and it's good to have a broader view.
Yep, it's certainly a good way of exploring new journals. Sometimes you run into problems if you try to compare across fields. We talked about, originally it was created to compare journals within a field for specific use, and I think that's what you're referring to there as well. If you go across fields, you can actually see substantially high variation. These are the highest impact factor journals in different fields. And we talked earlier about how, say, computer science has very different citation patterns than pediatrics. And so what you see here reflected is, again, there are a number of journals that probably are not surprising. You see some review journals that rise to the top. But you see a lot of variation from, say, JAMA Pediatrics with 10.769 to Biomaterials 8.78 down to the highest nursing journal, International Study of Nursing Studies, International Journal of Nursing Studies, 3.656. Does that mean the articles in one are better than the articles in another just because the impact factor is higher? Probably not. It's all about the citation patterns. For a nursing journal, for example, that field is very heavily based on practitioners, not necessarily researchers. A successful article in that field isn't necessarily going to be cited 1,000 times. it'll hopefully be read. It'll have implications on clinical practice. Some of the broader fields, like say a pediatrics, if you think about pediatrics as a specialty, a lot of people who publish what would be considered pediatric articles aren't necessarily publishing in pediatric journals. You've got pediatric oncology, you've got pediatric allergy, pediatric immunology. There's any number of fields, and so those more general categories also suffer a bit from that as well. So I guess the message here again is just making sure that you've done your research, that you're not putting too much emphasis on one source, on one metric, but thinking about it from a balanced perspective. And once you've selected that journal, I do encourage people to read the instructions for authors. I was a managing editor, as was referred to earlier. I spent hours of my life crafting the most magnificent instructions for authors. It was my war and peace. It was thousands of pages probably if you printed it all out, and no one ever read it. I am convinced. And that's okay. What you need to look for here is what makes a journal unique. You'll start to see, and a lot of journals are playing with some standardization around formatting so you can easily spot the differences. But take a quick look at those instructions for authors just to see if there's anything unusual. You don't have to necessarily flip through all the descriptions about references. It's good to know what style they use, but you don't have to go into depth on there. But do they ask for, say, a bulleted list of clinical implications? Do they ask for a special section that most other journals don't ask for? Those are the things that make it really clear that you've read, that you're considering this journal properly, you've done your evaluation. Like I said earlier, the journal you submit to first isn't necessarily going to be the journal that ends up publishing you, but no editor wants to get a paper that's obviously been formatted for science and is submitted to them without anything to indicate that it's them. So think about that carefully. As you go to submit to a new journal, are there any changes I need to make here, any modifications? If you have a cover letter, make sure that you've changed the title of the journal in that cover letter. Make sure that you've addressed the correct editor. Certainly don't begin it with "Dear Sir." That's a colleague of mine who works over on The Lancet. That is one of her pet peeves, and she will admit she's negatively predisposed towards any paper that comes in that says "Dear Sir." So just be mindful of these sort of things as you go from one journal to another, that you've actually taken a look at it and what's appropriate. Before we move to the next section, any further comments? No? Any questions from the audience about selecting a journal? Okay. So now we'll move into the journal publishing cycle, or as I like to call it, where did my paper go? Will I ever see it again? This is what the cycle basically looks like. We're going to start by talking about the submission and peer review processes. If you haven't already, you will soon run into one of what is really a very small number of online submission and peer review systems. It's helpful that there's so few of them sometimes, because it means that you get used to the quirks in one because you've seen it over in another journal. You know what information it's going to ask for and when. You know when's a good time to go get a cup of coffee because this is going to take a while that thing churns in the background. They tend to not be very well liked, these types of review systems, because they ask a lot of questions. They're not necessarily the most efficient in some ways. When I started in publishing, we would receive manuscripts in triplicate in the mail. We would FedEx out copies of those manuscripts to potential peer reviewers who would fax us back their reviews, hopefully. And then we would type this all up into one nice letter and we would mail it out to the author who had submitted those triplicates. I can tell you, this system is actually a lot more efficient and effective than that used to be. It allows you to turn around things quicker than you could. It also allows people to be engaged who maybe couldn't be in the past. So new researchers, researchers who are still forming their careers, researchers who have moved, researchers in certain parts of the world. So there's a lot of benefits to these systems, but at the same time, it is advised that you're aware of them, that you know what to expect when you go into them. There are still a surprising number of journals that will allow you to email your submission. This is very rare, so in most cases you're going to go through these systems. And once that paper is received, it's probably going to be processed by the editorial office, sent to an editor who, if they decide that it's sufficiently within scope and meets certain other basic criteria for their journal, is going to send it out for peer review. A lot of journals try to be very mindful of their reviewers as a finite resource. If they don't think a paper has a significant chance of success within their journal, they might return it to you and say, thanks for inviting us to consider this. It's so far outside of our scope, I don't think it's going to work. Or there's a fatal flaw in this paper that makes it not fit with our needs or standards. Those tend to be quickly turned around. If you haven't heard anything within the first week or so, hopefully that's a positive sign that's moved on. And that's where we invite the external peer reviewers. So peer review, at its best, is supposed to help determine the quality, validity, significance, and originality of research. I'm sure we can all think of cases where peer review has not worked as intended, papers that have been published and then found to have significant mistakes or problems later. We don't think about the many, many papers and errors that were caught before they were published. So hopefully it is helping to improve the quality, but it's not an error-free process. Right? It's a human endeavor. These are people who are actually reading the papers, who are actually commenting on the papers. I highlighted originality here because one of the interesting changes that's happening is that some journals are trying to take that out of the equation. They're trying to not look at novelty as a standard because it discourages certain kinds of research. It discourages reproduction, reproducibility. It discourages maybe research that is not groundbreaking, but it's just a nice incremental advance, which is, after all, what so much of science is built on. So some of these journals, what they call the sound science journals, will look at it from that perspective. Other journals will look at it and say, is this sufficiently novel? Is this sufficiently, I don't want to say groundbreaking again, but does it move the field sufficiently to be published in our journal? It's a different philosophy. One's not necessarily inherently better or worse than the other, but it's good to know what to expect when you go into the process. There are different variations to peer review. This came up earlier. Most scientific and medical journals use what's called blind or single blind. This is where the reviewers know who the authors are, but the authors don't necessarily know who the reviewers are. And so you'll get your comments back, and it'll say comments from the editor, comments from reviewer 1, reviewer 2, and then reviewer 3. And there's all sorts of jokes about reviewer 3 and how they wreck everyone's lives because they're usually the tie-breaking vote that makes the decision. But that's the single blind version. Double blind says, well, that's not really fair, right? Because that means that some of those biases that we talked about earlier, maybe that reviewer had a bias that wasn't declared, that wasn't detected. So maybe we make it double blind and we say, okay, we're not going to tell the reviewers who the authors are. They'll be judged purely on the work, which is great in theory. There's certainly been any number of cases of biases that have come up. Part of the challenge here is that if you look at the reference list of an article, you can sometimes suss out who the author was. If you work within a certain field, you can sometimes figure out who it was. Interestingly, there was a study a couple of years ago that looked at this phenomenon and found that reviewers weren't as good as figuring out who the author was as they thought they were. And similarly, authors aren't as good at figuring out the reviewers as they think they are. So there might be something there. The open peer review philosophy goes the opposite direction. It says, let's actually just open the whole thing up. Authors will know who the reviewers are. Reviewers will know who the authors are. Because the reviewers have to use their names, they won't say anything inappropriate. They'll be hopefully a little bit more constructive with their criticism. Of course, it does raise the question of if you're invited to review the work by some very prominent person in your field, perhaps a person upon whose decision your career might depend at some point, does that affect the type of comments you make? These are questions that have to be asked too. So all of these versions have different advantages or reasons to pause. Pre and post publication is another area where we're seeing a lot of experimentation. The traditional model is you review it and then you publish it. So we're thinking, okay, what if we put it out and then let people review it? You get more people who are able to review it. What you find there is, it's like with commenting, right? You put it out there, and you get either no comments, or you get a lot of useless comments, or maybe you get a few actually helpful comments. So trying to find a balance there. When you get a decision back on your manuscript on first decision, it's going to probably be one of 3 different types. Rejection is by far the most common. You want to learn from the feedback provided, proof your work for a resubmission. Now, does this mean that you have to accept a rejection? Most journals will have some policy whereby you can rebut. You can contest a rejection decision. This has usually got to be based on one of 2 things. A gross misunderstanding of the science that you can prove. So if in 30 pages of comments they made one typo on page 19, you can't say, see, the reviewer doesn't know anything. You can't assess me based on that. If they consistently confuse B cells and T cells, maybe there's something there. So that's something to look for. If there's evidence that someone's misunderstanding of the science involved has affected their evaluation of your paper, there might be grounds. A provable bias, the hardest thing to do, because a lot of people don't come out and say, I'm biased against this group, or I'm biased against you. There was a case a couple of years ago with a paper, and I won't say it was Science, where the reviewer said, and this got through to the author, the reviewer said, maybe you should try resubmitting this paper with a male co-author. Yes, exactly. Obviously, a case to be made for appealing that decision based on a bias, right? And it was. It was effectively, well, it was tried by the Court of Social Media first, and then, so those are really the 2 main areas. Misunderstanding of the science or obvious and provable bias. Even so, there are some rules to rebutting a decision. Number 1 is wait 24 hours. Just general rule. I've seen some letters written. People would probably have taken back if they'd had those 24 hours. Cool down a little bit, think about it, and then see if you still want to contest it. Know that there's a good chance that the editor will share any comments with the reviewers to see if it changes their opinion. So no name calling, no questioning the reviewer's intelligence, because if you're not willing to say it to that person directly, you probably don't want to risk the chance that the editor is going to share it with them. And do respond to the major points, the critical points, as to why, and make your case as to why this is worthy of reconsideration. They don't have to honor the rebuttal, but it's something to be aware of. The next 2 types of decision are around revision. You might not know the difference. They're not going to necessarily come out and say, congratulations, you got a minor revision decision. But there is a difference. Minor revision is usually a good sign. It's stylistic things or rephrasing small, easily correctable parts of your manuscript. If you get that back, make those changes quickly and resubmit it while the interest is still there, while the editor, while the reviewers are still enthusiastic about your paper. If you wait for the maximum allowed time, you don't know what else might come out in the meantime. People's passion for your paper might cool a little bit, and they might see it a little bit differently in that time. So try and strike while the iron is hot, as they say. Major revision. You're going to get a lot of comments. Some of them will be structural. Some of them will be asking for more experiments. You want to answer the comments one by one and explain why you made the changes or not. And you don't have to make every change that's requested of you by a reviewer or editor. Editors will sometimes highlight which ones they think are critical, but if you don't make it, you need to be very clear as to why you did not make that. You want to submit that revised version. You want to make it clear where your changes have been made. So it's easy for the reviewer, because the reviewers already spend time on the paper. They're going to go look in. What you really want them to be able to do is just say, okay, what did I say last time? How has that been addressed? Am I comfortable with that? Great. And we can move on. If you make it hard for them to find where those changes are, it will negatively impact the review. People might go through the paper a little bit differently the second time. So you just want to try and make it as easy as possible for everyone involved. And know that acceptance is not guaranteed. Maybe there's something in your responses where the editor or reviewer says, oh, well, I hadn't realized that before, but now that you've answered it that way, I realize that there's this problem with the paper. Or maybe they're not convinced by the responses you gave. So do give it your honest shot, and really editors try not to reject manuscripts after they've already received that first round of revision, and certainly they don't want to keep a process going any longer than necessary for authors. Any more comments on peer review before I move on?
I would just make a general comment that reviewers of these manuscripts, they're doing this on a volunteer basis, and they're busy. So, a lot of them will often look for the fatal flaw just to get it off their desk. And so that just sort of gets to the point at, before you submit your project to the IRB or whatever you're doing, spend enough time ahead of time thinking about it and, meeting with a librarian and going through that really complete literature search and meeting with a statistician to go through the methodology so that you don't do all of this work and then have some reviewer just, kill it because of a fatal flaw that you missed.
Yeah. Very true.
And I'll just add that really, really carefully read the reviewer comments and really respond to them, because there is nothing that upsets them more than for them to tell you exactly what they want you to do and you don't do it. That's a good way to get it rejected after 1 or 2 rounds of review.
Yep.
Just a question for you, George. Dr. Chang brought up the IRB, and we've seen instances where this has come up. Can you comment about the trend towards more strict expectations around IRB approval and documentation upstream of work being conducted, as we've seen some disappointment in situations?
Sure. And that, to some degree, that will go back to the ethical part as well there, is the idea that you want to make sure you've obtained those approvals up front. We do see some papers sometimes where people will say, I'm surprised this got IRB approved. And having that stamp, having that approval that your research has gone through that is critical, particularly as the fields diversify, as we pull in more people from different parts of the world where IRBs are evaluating things a little bit differently. There's really a challenge to have each community cohere its values, to cohere its ideas around that. As you probably know, one of the topics that people in publishing have been struggling with a little bit recently now is the whole gene editing situation from earlier this year. And the research was done. Does it now get published so that it can be put out there so that it can be evaluated? Or just the fact that it went through some questionable approval policy or approaches mean that it should not be put out there through a formal journal at all. So I think that these are probably questions we're going to see increasing, and that's one of the reasons why you're starting to see those questions coming from editors, from reviewers earlier in that process, trying to make sure that really this has been vetted from that perspective.
Follow-up question for you, which comes up very frequently, is work that started in the clinical realm, work that started in a quality improvement setting and was not meant for publication but was done for PDSA improvement cycles, then has a finding that's important, and the group wishes to now move forward with publication. Different journals respond differently in terms of the lack of IRB pre-processing and review and approval.
Yeah, and I think one of my messages today is that there are people involved with journals. I mean, it seems like something so obvious, but there's different philosophies, there's different approaches there. So we talked a little bit about some of the general rules that most editors will follow, but you are going to find some variation because it's a subjective decision in a lot of ways. It's not necessarily a hard and fast rule, like so many of these things. Right? For plagiarism, plagiarism is more than this many words. It's really a subjective evaluation. So in cases like that where there is no hard and fast rule, you do find editors making a decision on a case-by-case basis. And that's why a group like COPE, which is cross-publisher, cross-journal, can be helpful because they can provide at least guidance based on what people have done in the past. They can share expert recommendations But that's all it's going to be, is just a recommendation, just guidance. Unless there's a law that gets passed, unless something becomes accepted practice, you are going to see that variation. So we're going to talk about what happens after you've been accepted. In the good old days, in the old days, you had basically two versions of your manuscript. You had the final published version, and then you had that original version that you'd written out in cursive or typed on a typewriter somewhere. Because of technology, we now have the ability to create multiple stages of an article and to publicly share any or all of these stages of an article. So I want to talk a little bit about these because they do have a few ramifications. Preprints is the version probably before you've submitted to a journal. Sometimes it's the version that you submit to the journal, ideally. And it can be shared in any number of ways. A lot of journals are moving in this direction, and I think within health and science, within health and medical sciences, I should say, there's some evolving thoughts here. Because obviously you need to be careful about releasing information that hasn't been vetted appropriately. But there's still a push to think about how can we get information out there earlier, expose it to that vetting in a safe, controlled way. There's a new preprint server called medRxiv that's launched that is looking at exactly these kinds of questions, trying to follow up on the success that we've seen in archive over in physics, certain areas of physics, bioarchive in the biological sciences, and basically it's the idea of being able to publicly share this version of your manuscript before or at the point of submission. Once the paper's gone through the review process, there's now an accepted version of the manuscript, whatever you submitted for the final round of review that's been accepted. And this one's important because a lot of journals, in trying to speed up communication of science, are now making this version publicly available. And they say, okay, it's been through the review process, we can put it out there, share it with the world. And the trick here is that one of the things I've found personally, at least, is that if there's any good way to find that you've misspelled a co-author's name, it's to submit to one of these journals. Because that is by far the largest question or concern I get for people who've had their accepted version posted online is, whoops, I completely misspelled my co-author's name. How do I fix that? And at the point it's out there publicly, maybe it's been picked up by PubMed already, so there's some certain amount of disentanglement that needs to be done. So my message here is just a call to you to make sure that if you're submitting a revised manuscript or any manuscript really, make sure that you have given it that extra read to try to catch those embarrassing mistakes. I had one about a month ago now. The person had misspelled their own name. And were very concerned when they did a PubMed search and it wasn't showing up, and then they looked at it and realized, whoops, I forgot that letter. So make sure that you've done that extra read, that you've caught anything. It will get fixed, it will get corrected as the time goes on, as later versions of the article become available, but you really want to try and minimize the chances of that happening. At some point you'll receive a proof, and this will be when the typesetter and the copy editor have worked their magic on the paper and have hopefully done more good than harm, and you can go in and take a look and think about, okay, is that really how I want it to look? Do I have any final refinements here? Now, what's important about the proof stage is that at this point you should be just really correcting any things that you might have missed before and just reviewing to make sure that everything really does look good. This is not the time to be adding authors. This is not the time to be adding whole new sections to your paper, because all those things require a paper to go back to that editor, potentially to the reviewers, to see if this changes how that manuscript is received. So really it's for corrections at this point. And then you've got the final published version of the article. Yes?
Does anyone ever proof a mobile-friendly version of the article? We'll look at that later.
Good question. So she was asking if anyone ever proofs a mobile-friendly version of the article. So most of the ones I have experience with, what you're proofing is the PDF, right? It's not. I haven't seen a journal yet where you proof the HTML in the way that you're describing, so that you would see how the responsive design aspects of it, how it would go. I think that I wouldn't be surprised if we see that coming, Already, certainly, I can talk about at our company, we're moving towards more of an HTML-based proofing process, where you're making sure the content is right, and then it'll be fed into any number of different ways. But I think it's a very good question, but so far I'm not aware of any. And I don't see anyone rushing to correct me. So, good, good. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so now we're going to publish, and this is actually very relevant to what you just asked. Because now, when you think about publication, you're all of a sudden going out in all sorts of different formats. Not just print, electronic, you've got mobile. Even electronic isn't necessarily so simple. You've got your PDF, you've got your HTML version, you might be on multiple platforms, it might render slightly differently. That's why proofing that content is really the most important part, but this is also where probably the part that's most susceptible to issues with electronic rendering are tables. Because figures, they're going to render in a certain way. You can ideally just download the source file, you can access that source file. Text usually is fairly reliable, except maybe it's got annoying line breaks occasionally. But tables are the ones that get most disrupted. So you really want to make sure that you're creating tables that are as clear, simple as possible, spending the time on the proofing to make sure that everything is aligned in the way that you would want, because sometimes that does happen during the proofing process as someone collapses a column into another or tries to merge things that don't belong, or just the shading that a journal uses might be confusing. So making sure that you've thought about that. Once it's been published, as we talked about earlier, archiving is extremely important. So now we're going to move on to author rights, which is, I think, probably one of the more misunderstood aspects of publishing. So again, please do feel free to ask questions as we go. Copyright. So the basic idea is that the author, some cases their institution, depending on the arrangement, has the right under national copyright laws and international treaties to control how the works are to be used and distributed by others. No one can do anything with that paper you created until you've given them permission. The extent of copyright rights include allowing authors to permit copying, distribution, online access, translation, creation of derivative works. Why does this matter to publishing? Publishers cannot publish an article unless they're granted the right to do so. So usually you'll be asked to provide some paperwork at some point during the process. Often it'll be the corresponding author on behalf of other authors. Sometimes it'll be each individual author. That has some variation from journal to journal. There's two different flavors. In subscription journals, it's more traditional to ask the author to transfer the copyright to the publisher. Not all journals do this. Some just ask you to do the second version, which is licensing. You retain the copyright, but you give the publisher the express permission to publish the article, and it usually involves some other rights carried across. These are legal documents, and you should always read them and not just treat them like those terms and agreements that you just click through. And I actually just did that earlier this morning and then immediately felt hypocritical for doing so. Always make sure you know what you're reading, what you're signing off on. Then is the time to ask questions. Right? And this is where, again, librarians can be a good resource because they've probably seen any number of these things over the years. They probably have experience. They know what's kind of normal looking, what's not. They also might have some ideas if you have specific concerns about how you might approach that. Even if you've signed a transfer of copyright, under fair use clauses and different publisher policies, you will retain a number of rights. So it's not like you are handing over ownership of your paper and now you can't do anything with it ever again. These vary significantly. This sample is taken from Elsevier's policies. It's just a sampling of things that are not given away. Teaching and making copies of the article for use in classroom teaching, sharing it with research colleagues, expanding it and using it in compilations, your thesis, your dissertation, we get a lot of those requests. We consider that automatically part of the author rights. Use in educational materials, handing it out at a conference if you present on the research, and then patent and trademark rights not affected. There's a site called howcanishare.com, which is a publisher agnostic site, which provides more information and tries to make this whole process a lot easier. But basically, the idea is that it's your work, you created it, and there's no reason to stand in the way of scholarly communication, scholarly sharing. what you will find, and this is why I talked about the versions of an article earlier, is that the later you get in the process, the more involvement that publishing staff have had on a paper, that tends to be where they tend to get a little bit more strict about some of these rights discussions. A preprint pretty much can be shared with anyone at any time. It's up to you to define those terms. Once you get to the final published version of an article, where it's got the journal branding, the typesetting's been done, the copy editing's been done, it's been gone through the whole review process and been approved, that's where you start to see a little bit more tightening, because the idea is that you don't want to enable a situation where basically a journal can be created wholesale or recreated wholesale somewhere else. Right? That's really what the concern is there. So if you have any questions, again, librarians are great resources here because there is such variation, and they can probably help you disentangle it. But it also segues nicely into the discussion of open access. So open access, you're going to hear talk about two basic models, green and gold. And gold is free public access to the final published article immediately and permanently upon publication. In a lot of cases, there's a fee. So again, this is one of those things you want to look for in that instructions for authors. We get a lot of cases where you submit to a paper not realizing that it's an open access journal, and all of a sudden you get that invoice saying, hey, don't forget to pay, and you think, what? I didn't sign up for this? Or at least this is, again, the version we hear. Realistically, hopefully you've been asked about it a few times along the way, but just be aware of that. The usage by an end user is determined by the license you signed. We'll talk about that in just a second. There's a few different approaches. There's journals that are entirely open access. There is what are called hybrid journals, which publish some subscription content, but if you pay a fee, then that article will be made open access. So there's a few different approaches there. You always want to make sure you've checked any requirements of your institution or your funding body regarding many aspects of open access. Posting in an institutional repository. I understand Albany Medical College doesn't have one. If you're at a different institution, though, just be mindful of that. If your funder has any expectations, make sure you know what those are, because what we tend to get is a lot of emails round about grant submission time where people realize that they didn't check all the boxes when they submitted their work on their previous grant, and now they're being asked to provide documentation that they don't have. So make sure you've thought about that up front. Now, because there is that fee, this can seem deterring. This is great. I don't have the funding to use for that. How can I still participate in open access? How can I still publish open access? That's where green open access comes in. Green open access says free public access to a version of your article. Probably the version of green you're most familiar with would be PubMed Central, where any NIH-sponsored paper, the accepted version is made available no more than 12 months following publication. And usually publishers do this on authors' behalf. That policy has evolved over time. Originally, authors only could do it, but the compliance rates were really low. And then a lot of publishers started taking this on, and that's made it a lot easier. But some publishers do still expect the authors to do it. So just be aware of that going in and make sure you're clear about what to expect there. That's where I get all those emails. Where's my PMC ID? Well, you didn't mark the paper as NIH sponsored. Somehow left that out of the paper. So make sure you've declared your funding. Make sure you've complied appropriately. Now the trade-off, because there's no fee involved, is that there is often that embargo period. That's the idea, is that then the period before embargo is used for the recouping of costs by the journal, but that you don't have to pay anything additional. This is why the NIH has traditionally kind of liked this approach. There's no additional money necessarily going into the system. There are a few other types of open access, sponsored open access, sometimes called diamond open access. You could get a society, an institution that subsidizes, right? And makes it free for authors, free for readers, because they're covering all the costs. The costs are always covered somewhere along the way. User licenses, especially with open access articles, sometimes with other types of articles, you might be asked to select a user license. And these tend to have complicated abbreviations like CC by 4.0, CC BY NC ND. These all mean different things. Basically, CC is Creative Commons. The NC there is non-commercial, ND being non-derivative. So what this does is this says, I don't need to have someone ask my permission as long as people stick within these frameworks. The non-commercial application, for example, means you can do things with my paper as long as you're not going to make money off of them. If you aren't going to make money off of them, I need to be asked. Someone needs to come to me and ask my permission. The non-derivatives says, if you're going to reuse my paper, it has to be in its entirety as it is. You can't do any crazy remixing, cutting and pasting sort of approach. What's important is that pretty much all of the licenses, except for the very, very most liberal, are going to require attribution at all points. So just because you're assigning to say someone can do these things, doesn't mean you're not going to get credit for it. They should still be citing the article. And also important for people who don't have the funding but still want to make sure that their work is getting used in appropriate ways, is getting disseminated in appropriate ways, is the Research for Life collaboration. The relevant one for our group would be HINARI, the Health Internetwork Access to Research Initiative, which provides free or low-cost access to thousands of peer-reviewed journals to public institutions in over 100 developing countries. So even if you're publishing in a traditional subscription journal, most major publishers are participating in one of these initiatives to make sure that those articles are available through the World Health Organization. Any questions on open access before we move to our final section? Okay. So getting your paper noticed. You've just published your article. Congratulations. Currently, as of 2013, there are almost 40 million articles available somewhere online. The number of new papers per year is quite large. Elsevier itself publishes some 400,000, and we are one of about 5,000 different publishers. So there's a lot of research being published every year. The average time spent on reading that literature is 7 hours per week, which is at once a lot of time and also not a lot of time. So how do you make sure that your paper is not falling through the cracks? Because according to one study, this one from Learned Publishing 2012, 40% of researchers surveyed said they had actually not read the whole article for the last important article that they'd read. Time is a precious resource. Time is a finite resource. So how do we balance this? There are things that you can do to help make your paper rise in people's attention. This starts when you're preparing your article, spending time on that abstract and conclusion and references. The abstract and conclusion, because these are the things that people are going to read. Even if you've got a paper that you're publishing subscription, paper that you're publishing open access, it's still going to be that abstract that more people are going to read than not. We talked about that earlier. The references, because that's where the linking comes in, right? If you've got one paper citing out to another, the internet loves links. It loves these connections. And so being able to think carefully about those links can really help you. Sharing your research data, if appropriate, and linking to it in your article. The article is one version of research output. It doesn't have to be the only research output to come from a study. There are many different ways of approaching this. Be very careful with medical data, but there are ways of sharing this information in different ways. Using easy-to-understand charts and professional-looking illustrations. If anything, our society is moving more and more to graphics and less to text. This is painful for me. I'm one of those people who doesn't like to watch the video. I like to read the article. But realistically, more and more people are looking for those catchy images. We rolled out graphical abstracts a few years ago, and they pop up next to people in the next articles and search results. And there really has been a statistically significant effect on people clicking through, because that image will grab your attention. Certainly with Twitter, there's all sorts of research showing that if you include a graphic in Twitter, it makes people more likely to interact. Make sure that you've used clear and correct manuscript language, and choosing the right journal is a good place to start. Because for a lot of people, it is a filter. It is one way of choosing from those search results where they're going to start. There's a lot of stuff that's done behind the scenes to do with search engine optimization to hopefully make that stand out. Things that you can do on the author side means making sure that your key terms are included in your title. Again, this is where those jokey titles can sometimes backfire against you because you're not using the terms you want people to search on. Abstracts, highly searchable. Make sure those terms are in there carefully. Don't be afraid to promote your own work. You can't just sit around and wait for someone else to do it. You can start the conversation too. Don't be afraid to network at conferences. And I'm not advocating sitting there just talking to people about nothing about what you're doing, but thinking about ways to network strategically, to share with people what you're excited about, what you're working on. And online too. If you have a media-worthy article, something you think is going to have significant public interest, get to know your media relations team. And I'm sure Albany Medical College has a very good one. Talk to them. See what kinds of things they look for. What kind of research do they like to know about? Because they try to stay on top of everything coming out of their own institutions, but they especially like things that are new and just coming out. So if you can let them know about something exciting you've got on the way, it helps them. Social media, we talked earlier about the one mention of a scholarly article every 7 seconds. Be mindful that the tweet is the message. According to a 2016 study in ACM Sigmetrics, 59% of shared URLs are never clicked on. People are basically taking the message of that tweet and that becomes the message of your article for many of them. So think carefully about that. If you're tweeting out your whole title now that they've expanded the character limit, that can be helpful. But think about whether there's a better way of saying it in a concise way. Social collaboration networks, Mendeley, ResearchGate, academia.edu, good way to profile yourself, profile your research. Now, when I talked earlier about being careful about sharing the final published version of your article, this is one area where sometimes people get caught up because the idea is that you, in most cases, unless it's an open access journal, would not be sharing the final published version of your article publicly. If it's to a small group, to a defined network, that can be different, but if you're sharing it publicly, you probably don't want to have that final published version. Tips for effective outreach. You want to make sure you keep it short, accurate, and relevant. Make it easy to find out more. As a new parent a few years ago, I would always read about this exciting new research, and they'd highlight it in parenting magazines. They wouldn't tell me who did the research. They wouldn't tell me what journal it was published in. They would just describe the result in terms that, to be honest, I was taking on face value, but it was the journalist's interpretation. So make it easy. Anytime you're talking about your work, how do they reach you? How do they find the published version of the article? Understand that even if you're careful, your work may still be misrepresented because, again, many people react without reading an article with their own agenda. There was this great article on NPR's website back in 2014, Why Doesn't America Read Anymore? Oh, people got really mad about this one. It's the decline of society, it's the end of the world as we know it, people should read more. And then you look at the date, which is hidden in the URL up there, April 1st. Because if you click through on that link, it takes you to a little stub that says, we noticed some people were reacting to our articles without having giving signs that they actually read them. We were curious to see if that would happen here. And it did. Understand that journalists are very well aware that compelling headlines attract more readers. They want to make it sensational. They want to make it exciting. Anytime there's public communication of science, you have to worry about certain common misunderstandings or misrepresentations. Sample size, p-value, causality, other variables. This wonderful BMJ article looked at press releases and found that 40% of those included exaggerated advice, 33% exaggerated causal claims, and 36% exaggerated inference to humans from animal research. I think this goes back to the question earlier. In your title, do you include whether this is an animal study, human study, et cetera? When news articles were based on those releases, those percentages just increased and compared to the control group. It's like the game of telephone, right? Where you start with a message on that side and you whisper it across to someone, and by the time it gets to the other side of the room, it's very little relation to what you started with. So just be mindful in any of your communication, you can control that original message, but after that, it's on its own. And the nice thing about this is there's all sorts of new ways to monitor your article, provide article level metrics. You've probably run into Altmetric at this point, which tracks social media usage, amongst others. Plum Analytics does the same thing. Looking at different sources, the idea is that we're not limited to just tracking citations anymore. We can track so much more about the impact of an article and the impact of research. So I've included some further reading here. The Researcher Academy link to there has a whole bunch of videos and workshops and presentations that you can go through at your own leisure about the research journey, about publishing in general, all free. And my email address is included on that title slide as well as right there. So I will ask the panel if they have any final words of wisdom to impart to us before opening it up to any more questions. No? All right, wonderful. Then I will open it to the group for any questions that you would like to ask. Stunned silence? Thank you.
So thank you, George, very much. You gave us a lot to think about. Certainly you can contact George with any questions or stop into the library, see any of the librarians. You know where to find us. Thank you for coming. Password. Let's see if Amanda is here. Today 6. Oh, okay.